Welcome to the Damascus Road podcast. On the road to Damascus, Paul had a radical encounter with Jesus and his life was changed forever. That is what we hope and pray for here. Now, on to this week's episode.
All right, there are things that we all learn from our parents. And one that I learned from mine is, and this is from my dad and specifically, is the love of a good deal. I have memories of us going out to McDonald's as a family, and my dad would have one of the cards that they sell as fundraisers where there's a buy one, get one free sandwich deal. And my dad would use it first, I think with my older brother. Then he would just turn around, pass it to me and my mom. Next transaction, we would use it, second free meal. And then sometimes we would be sitting there and someone would be like, I'm still hungry. And my dad would fish out the card and say, if you're going to get one sandwich, you might as well get two. And they would go back up there. And there was a rule that every transaction, that you could only use it once for a transaction. And for my family and a family of 5, that necessitated at least 3 buy one, get one frees. Now, I don't do this exactly, but me and Zane have been known to go to McDonald's and use the deals on both of our apps on our phones separately. So we could both get one, because again, there's a rule that it's got to be one per transaction. So it's kind of like the same thing, but with technology. This could be considered morally borderline by some, but it is legal. It's not what the restaurant wants you to do, and there are those that would be ashamed of such behavior and consider it cheap. This is not the attitude that I got from my father. I don't consider this cheap. I consider it smart, or winning the game of getting more for less. After being raised this way, I went off to college in the fall of the year of 2000. Yes, I'm quite old. I had a new computer my parents gave me as a graduation gift with a fairly large hard drive, which would prove important. Upon arriving with my new computer, I learned about file sharing. Basically, from a combination of the university's intranet, where people could just share files with each other on the university computer, and sites that were wildly popular like Napster, I had access to digital copies of basically every song in existence, a lot of movies, tons of episodes of The Simpsons, and probably other lesser TV shows that I don't remember as well. And as I was instilled with a love of a good deal and getting things for free, I downloaded all of it. Now, looking back on this, I now know that this was all piracy. It was stealing. File sharing makes it sound very positive, like how we're all taught to share our toys with our friends and siblings. Now, was I part of some weird piracy ring at the school, falling in with the wrong crowd right after going to a scary secular college? No. I mean, I had a couple of questionable roommates my freshman year who were in a band, which was Dave and Ryan. So they may have been bad influences. And I was part of a campus ministry. So really, I was not in a bad crowd. The thing is, at this time, everyone was doing this. I did more than some, perhaps. I don't know that everybody downloaded everything. But Napster and other file sharing platforms were rampant. I also, on this new computer, had a CD burner. I don't know if young people know what this is, but I had a CD burner. And I remember when U2's album, All That You Can't Leave Behind, came out, we burned, 20 or 30 copies of it from Napster, and gave it to all kinds of people. So a strange thing was happening. We were getting something of value for no money. And for reference back then, a new release CD was something like $18, which in today's dollars is like 30, by the way. But no one really thought this was wrong. I was never accused of anyone by stealing from artists. No one told me I shouldn't be burning CDs full of songs that I paid nothing for. We all pretty much knew what was going on, but no one had a problem with it. The author of the book that inspired our series, John Mark Comer, was in college at the same time of me, and was apparently a college student of stronger moral fiber. During this time, he also downloaded, burned, and shared CDs from Napster, but he eventually felt convicted that this was stealing and told other people that he wasn't doing it anymore and that they probably shouldn't either. When he would turn down the CDs, the result from people was strong pushback and contempt. People would ask him, "Who are you to judge us?" And if you fast forward a bit, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but the band Metallica won a lawsuit against Napster, basically saying you're stealing our intellectual property, which they were. They lost a bunch of fans in the process, which is kind of like the reaction that Comer had from people just on a large scale. People were mad that all of a sudden they couldn't get free stuff, and they took it out on Metallica. Napster got shut down, had to pay a big fine. Other sites popped up that were doing the same thing, but they got progressively shadier as time went on. And Apple started selling digital versions of songs for 99 cents back when they didn't make phones and only made iPods. So there was a legitimate version of digital music that was available. And now it was very clear to everyone that what we had all been doing was stealing, or at the very least piracy, which is actually just another name for the same thing, but still bad because pirates stole. But so the thing that was weird is that this thing that was wrong had become right in the eyes of our culture. The shared culture between me and Comer and Dave and Ryan at the time of college students in the early 2000s. It wasn't just okay, but it was a correct behavior that was not to be challenged. And this is an example of what is meant by the world, the subject of the series that we're starting today. This is, as Dave said, this is the third series based on John Mark Comer's book, Live No Lies, where we're looking at the three enemies of the soul: the world, the flesh, and the devil. We covered the devil first, then the flesh, and now we're going to tie it all together by talking about the world. And for a recap, the overall idea of this book is that there is real truth that God has communicated to us. And it's not a truth that's just a list of do's and don'ts. It is our Creator, the creator of the world that we live in, telling us the best way to live. He's telling us what the good life looks like. And the three enemies of the soul are bombarding us with lies, often focused on the trustworthiness of God or alternative versions of what the good life would be. And it leads us to question whether what God or what Jesus says is actually good or actually true. And for a free recap, those messages are available on our podcast. The series titles were Talking Back to the Devil and The Slavery of Freedom. But the main idea that ties the three together is this. This is a working theory of the enemy's stratagem. It says, as followers of Jesus, we are at war with the world, the flesh, and the devil. And the three enemies' stratagem is as follows: deceptive ideas, the devil, that play to disordered desires, the flesh, that are normalized in a sinful society, the world. And this last enemy, the world, is especially nasty because it is the one that causes the biggest level of blindness in our lives. These things become normal, like the example of pirated music was when I was in college, which is about as trivial of an example as we'll see. We will turn the microscope on the world around us today. We'll look at what in our culture or current culture is accepted as right, that is a lie or a distortion of the truth. We will see ways that we have been or are changed by the world around us and how it pulls us away from God. And a little bit of application up front as we go through this. I want everyone to keep in mind the idea of being holy. And I feel like this is a word that has become unpopular, probably because of the phrase holier than thou. But what is actually meant by holy is being set apart. And it does mean, or being different. It does mean positively set apart, like you could be different by being much worse than everybody. That's not truly what holy means. It's being set apart, sacred, but different in those ways. So how are we supposed to be different? Well, we're going to talk about a lot of ways today how the world is anti-God. And these are areas where we should be different. We'll talk about how the world represents a powerful force to conform in order to belong and fit in. And being holy is what happens when we choose to align with God and his kingdom instead of aligning with the world. We will end up being different. We will end up being set apart if we do this. So keep that in mind. I'll come back to it in the end. But first, I want to clear up what is meant by the phrase the world, because of the three, I think this is, the flesh is kind of confusing too, but I think it's one of the more confusing, and why it's an enemy of the soul. Now, Jesus and his early followers talk about this a lot in the New Testament, but not in a way that we usually use the word now. So I remember when I was in college, I played baseball, one of my teammates asking me, hey, I saw on a billboard something that said, like, don't love the world, or the love of the world is bad. And he's like, what in the world did that mean? So I was one of the main Christian people that my teammates knew. So when there was something like this that was weird, they would ask me about it. I don't think I had a great response for him, and I don't actually remember what all I said. But his question gets at the distinction that we need to make about what we mean by the world. And the short answer is that the billboard had a different definition of the world than he did. Although I think he liked both his definition of the world and some aspects of the one we'll talk about in detail today. But to kind of go through the different definitions, the first way the Bible uses this term, we'll see in Romans 1. It reads, "For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, so they have no excuse for not knowing God." So here, the world is just talking about the creation or planet Earth. It's God's creation is what the world means. This second one, this is from the book of John and many signs that you've seen at sporting events. It says, "For this is how God loved the world. He gave his one and only Son, so that everyone who believes in him will not perish but have eternal life." So that one was John 3:16. In that scenario, the world means all the people of the world. So those are probably the two definitions that we understand the most. And when we say the world, we probably mean something like that. Now we'll look at two passages where it is used in the definition that we're most concerned about today, which is the enemy of the soul. And we're going to come back to, I think, at least one, if not both of these later. All right, this first one is from John. It's in John 17. It says, "I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, for they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it." And that was Jesus speaking, to clarify. This next one, this is 1 John, so a letter from the Apostle John to churches. He says, "Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever." So in these two passages, pretty clear as day that the world is a bad thing. Obviously not talking about creation of the whole earth, obviously not talking about all the people of the world. Also worth noting, in the first passage, Jesus says that it is not his prayer that his followers be taken out of the world. Nowhere in the Bible are we called to just shelter in place while we live in the world, even though there is danger. So everything we're going to talk about today, yes, there's danger. Yes, the world can be a bad influence on us, but never is Jesus calling us to retreat, to get out of it. So to summarize, there are three ways the world is used in the Bible. Two of them are good or neutral. The last one that we're talking about today is the enemy of the soul. First one was the universe or planet Earth. That was Romans 1. Second one was all the people of the world, John 3:16. The third one, this is a more detailed description that I'll go off of, is the system of practices and standards associated with secular society, one that attempts to live as if there is no God. That definition is also what the billboard my baseball teammate saw was likely referring to. This is the definition, obviously, that Jesus meant when he said that he is not of the world and neither are his followers. So Jesus' words and the idea of a society attempting to live as if there is no God, actually ends up playing out with the world being anti-God as they try to remove him from it, instead of just being indifferent to him or thinking he doesn't exist. And this plays out, Comer gives in the book a bunch of different definitions of the world, and I'll just share a few of them, and a lot of them kind of show that anti-God part. This first one, this is from Dallas Willard. He says, "Are cultural and social practices that are under the control of Satan and thus opposed to God." Another one, Gary Breshears, he said, "The world is Satan's domain where his authority and values reign. Though his deception makes it hard to realize. If you are of the world, then it all seems right." And then the last one, this is Comer summarizing in layperson's terms. He says, "The world is what happens when a lot of people give in to their flesh and base animalistic desires are normalized." All right, a quick example. And Comer goes into this in a lot of detail in the book, more than I'm doing. So with all of this, I feel like I'm doing an okay job explaining it, but if you read the book, it's outstanding. So the most glaring example of this is the history of slavery in America, in the South. This is a practice that started out with not that many people practicing it, but then it spread. It became accepted as something that was a necessary evil of society at first. People did kind of object to it to begin with, but then it spread more and more. It became ingrained in their economy and became protected by law. And then as generations went on, it just became kind of how things are. It was just the normal society that people were born into, at least in the states of the South. And that's what's meant by the world. When something like that starts out as what people see as an evil, then eventually just becomes normal and becomes okay. And that same example of racism, it stretches through to today. Even though we've clearly made progress in this area, especially from back in slavery. For example, I'm not that old in the context of the history of racism in America. However, I distinctly remember one of the main types of jokes that I heard as a kid were anti-Polish racist jokes. I heard them, I shared them. Was I a terrible kid? Maybe. But in my defense, all these years later, at the time, I was too young or too ignorant to even know that these jokes were racist. I didn't know racial slurs or even how to tell if someone is Polish, frankly. But the world I was raised in, the suburbs of Chicago in the 80s, was one where the default experience for an elementary school kid included racist jokes. Either that or a 7 to 8 year old me looked very receptive to this sort of thing, which I don't think was true. So kind of to summarize all this, John Mark Comer gives kind of a final summary definition of the world as a system of ideas, values, morals, practices, and social norms that are integrated into the mainstream and eventually institutionalized in a culture corrupted by the twin sins of rebellion against God and the redefinition of good and evil. This last part of his definition, the twin sins of rebellion against God and the redefinition of good and evil, are a callback to our previous series where we looked at the devil's temptation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The rebellion against God was the temptation to live apart from God, to seize control from him. With God out of the driver's seat, they have to decide what is good and evil apart from God. And in that example, they're going to go to what they hear in their head. And as we saw in the Garden of Eden, the devil in the form of a snake or serpent is sitting there giving them ideas, talking to them in the form of the snake. And then it's also informed by the disordered desires of their hearts. So in short, it is the devil in the person of the snake and the flesh, the disordered desires of their heart, that are what define good and evil apart from God. And when you extend that idea, and this is as Comer puts it, the world is what we call it when Adam and Eve's sin goes viral and spreads to everyone in society. All right, so how does this all happen? Remember the devil's stratagem. It's deceptive ideas that play to disordered desires that get normalized in a sinful society. So first, the deceptive ideas. These are the lies that are kind of dressed up as truth or in sheep's clothing. A key part of how sin going viral happens is when sin gets redefined as something else. Really as anything but sin, but it's often something that sounds either harmless or even positive. It will be called something like freedom, the way things are, boys will be boys, reproductive justice, or to go back to my intro example, file sharing, not stealing or piracy, just file sharing. Then once the sin is redefined and sounds harmless, or it sounds good, it spreads quite easily. Using the file sharing example, if every time we watched or listened to pirated content, we called it stolen or pirated, it would be a lot harder for it to become widely adopted, especially for people who think of themselves as moral and law-abiding, which I probably did back then. I don't know. I remember it not only being called file sharing, but that we talked about that the person who had done something wrong or illegal was the person who initially shared it, not all of us who were downloading it, or that it was the website that was hosting it. So if someone's going to get in trouble, it's them, which was kind of true. Not the thousands or millions of people who are benefiting with free music. It's whoever initially ripped the CD or facilitated the sharing that was really in trouble. The rest of us considered ourselves just innocent bystanders who happened to be benefiting with free music. Now, I had friends around me at the time giving these justifications. I was giving them. I can still basically spout off the reasons why it was fine. And we were all happily consuming all this free content in our group that all agreed that what we were doing was fine and even good. And this phenomenon of views, opinions, and moral choices spreading in groups of friends is well documented. People end up believing similarly to the people that they spend the most time around. Ideas and opinions spread within those social circles. We see it with political opinions. Like after elections, you'll hear people say, I don't know how this could possibly be right. Everyone I know voted for the candidate that lost. People's social media feeds end up being full of like-minded people as their opinions merge and people cull from their feed people who disagree. And these are kind of modern examples of something that has been known for years and comes up in the Bible in many places. In 1 Corinthians 15:33, it says, bad company corrupts good character. In Proverbs 13, it says, walk with the wise and become wise, associate with fools and get in trouble. And these nuggets of wisdom, they're actually across religions. You can read Proverbs in Buddhism. You can read all kinds of things that say the same thing, that you will end up believing and being more like the people that you hang around with. And even we have memories of mothers everywhere who say, I don't want you hanging around with that Casey character. Or I don't want you hanging around with Heston, which was Nolan's friend who said bad words in middle school. Or not middle school, in preschool, yeah. Zane's got plenty of friends who say bad words in middle school. So we become like the people that we hang around with. And this works for bad things as well as good things. People who are focused on health and exercise tend to rub off on people around them. But so do people who frequently skip class, are into recreational drugs, or even commit suicide. This is called social contagion. It is shown to be true of reading books or watching shows about suicide. There are studies on that. On the super serious side, and even to trivial things like fashion. Like, have you noticed how tons of kids have Zane's current hairstyle? They aren't all deciding independently that floppy and curly is a good look. Or that when, there was a picture where they all like make symbols. That, like whenever they take a picture, they all flash some kind of, it's like they're flashing gang signs, but they're not. They're just making a symbol. It's like a peace sign, but what, 3 and 4, those are the big ones? Yeah. So they all do that, all of them. And it's not, it's a combination, these ideas spread and they conform among friend groups, including all the way to getting perms if you want to have such a hairstyle and you don't have curly hair. All right, so after that, the other part of how this works is it plays to disordered desires. So let's go to the example of sexuality. So the example I gave of freedom earlier is basically like saying that, hey, this is a freedom, this is a free lifestyle. I'm able to do things that I really want to do anyway because I'm free. Things like having sex outside of marriage, having sex with multiple partners, really having no responsibility for your sexual behavior. Really, whatever it is that a person wants to do or desire becomes okay when you take God out of it. So really, when what you desire is okay, permissible, or even encouraged, it spreads very quickly. It's not just trying to fit in or to be fashionable, although it can be that. It's the combination of trying to fit in and that it aligns with something that people really want to do anyway. As John Mark Comer puts it in the book, I want it and everyone's doing it have a lot of power by themselves, but when they're combined, they are nearly irresistible. And this is how an idea quickly spreads and becomes mainstream and institutionalized. And this is how the enemies of the soul strategy comes together. Remember, it is deceptive ideas from the devil that play to disordered desires, the flesh, that are normalized in a sinful society, the world. And this is the way this happens. It's what has happened in the world. And it's what will continue to happen and what we need to be aware of so that we can recognize it and resist it. And the prime crux of this lie is that God is not real or not loving or not a moral authority in our lives. The lie is that we are the authority. People who seek to live as if there is no God look to themselves for what is right and wrong. They seek to find their authentic self, which really means to try to follow all of the desires found inside ourselves, without the consideration that some of those desires may be sinful, destructive, selfish, or petty. In Live No Lies, Comer quotes a leading atheist, Yuval Noah Harari, as saying, "In earlier times, it was God who could define goodness, righteousness, and beauty. Today, those answers lie within us. Our feelings give meaning to our private lives, but also to our social and political processes." And this actually makes a lot of sense. When we decide God isn't the authority, that we want to go our own way, we're left following whatever we can find in ourselves. And probably that's what we wanted to do. That's the idea there. So, and this isn't a new thing or a modern movement. We see it referenced in the Bible in the verse we looked at earlier in 1 John. For a recap, it says, "For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life comes not from the Father, but from the world." So 3 things: the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. These are the categories of desire that are found within us, or motivations for our action. They are lusts, which means that they are perverted loves. So let's look at them a little closer. So the lust of the flesh, the first one. This one we did a whole series on the flesh. Like lust as we think of it, the perverted love. Objectified sexuality falls into this category, which does include like consensual sex where the person is just an object of pleasure. Porn would be in this category. And also lust to fulfill any other desire, food, drink, really anything that we talked about in our flesh series. The next one, lust of the eyes. This would be greed, envy, jealousy, discontentment, any like trying to keep up with the Joneses, that sort of stuff. Selfish ambition and the restlessness of our age is all lust of the eyes. And then the pride of life. This is the human bent in all of us to go our own way, to rebel against authority, and the thought that we know better than our forebears. Who are you to tell me anything is the anthem of the pride of life. And these are common and old temptations of the world. And they are very similar to the temptations, or they are the temptations that the devil presented Jesus with in the desert after he had fasted for 40 days. So to kind of, if you remember that story, so Jesus obviously off in the desert, 40 days. This is all pulled from Matthew chapter 4. The first temptation that the devil gives to Jesus, he says, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become loaves of bread." Lust of the flesh. Jesus was hungry. He'd been fasting for 40 days. We've been fasting recently. I get pretty grumpy after one day. 40 days would be very rough. So this is again, the devil appealing to his lust of the flesh to make his own bread and sustain him. The second one, it says, "Next, the devil took him to the peak of a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. 'I will give it all to you,' he said, 'if you will kneel down and worship me.'" This is the devil appealing to his lust of the eyes. He says, look at all of this. You can have it all. All the wealth, all the glory. And then the last one, the pride of life. And this actually comes in Matthew. It comes before the last one we did. It says, "Then the devil took him to the holy city, Jerusalem, to the highest point of the temple, and said, 'If you are the Son of God, jump off. For the scriptures say he will order his angels to protect you, and they will hold you up with their hands so you won't even hurt your foot on a stone.'" So this is, at the height of the temple, that's like the tallest building there. If he jumps off, this is basically saying, create a spectacle. Show everyone that you are the Son of God, because God has promised that the angels will save you. This would make Jesus an instant celebrity, but not for doing good, not for being good or for saving people, but just for putting on a show. He would suddenly get millions of followers on the socials, and the cool ones, not just Facebook. This appealed to Jesus' desire for recognition, for fame and glory, which he spent time intentionally avoiding in his ministry. So this is also mirrored in the way that the devil tempts Adam and Eve in the garden. The fruit is described as good for food, which is the lust of the flesh, is appealing to the eye, which is the lust of the eyes, and is useful for gaining knowledge apart from God, which is the pride of life. These are ancient temptations, and in the world where God is removed as the authority, when people are living as if there is no God, these 3 desires are where people get their moral compass. And instead of being labeled as lust, which is sinful, they are redefined and celebrated. As Comer says in the book, he says, what was universally condemned is now celebrated. What was universally celebrated is now condemned, and those who refuse to celebrate are condemned. So this talks about, kind of changing the way things have been thought about. In the past, things were condemned, and now they're celebrated. And this is labeled as progress. And the hard thing is that sometimes it is progress. So like in the case of, it's certainly not always the case that like the world is moving from moral bankruptcy from a great moral place to moral bankruptcy. That's not always the case. Like in the examples of rights of women, rights of minorities, racism, like the world is trying to move everything in a good direction in all of those things. So it's not like you can just be like, the world's wrong all the time. We need to get back to the, 1940s when things were great. That's not true. They're just different things were bad back then. So what we're left with is that we have to kind of do the hard work of figuring out what in the world is good and in which ways is the world apart from God and turning its back on him. To do this, I want to go to a quote and example that Comer shares in the book. All right, it says, the late Dr. Larry Furtado, historian of early Christianity, in his widely celebrated book, Destroyer of the Gods, he told the story of how a tiny Jewish sect of Jesus followers overcame the bastion of paganism and won over the Holy Roman Empire in only a few centuries. His thesis is that it wasn't the church's relevance or relatability to the culture, but its difference and distinctness that made it compelling to so many. The church was marked by 5 distinct features, all of which made it stand out against the backdrop of the empire. Now, remember what I talked about earlier with what it means to be holy or set apart. This is exactly what this is talking about. It was their differences that made them compelling. All right, here's the list of 5 features. The first one, the church was multiracial and multi-ethnic, with a high value for diversity, equity, and inclusion. The second one, the earth was spread across socioeconomic lines as well. There was a high value of caring for the poor. Those with extra were expected to share with those with less. Third, it was staunch in its active resistance to infanticide and abortion. Fourth, it was resolute in its vision of marriage and sexuality between one man and one woman for life. And fifth, it was nonviolent, both on a personal level and a political level. Now, if you take those 5 things, and this is where if a visual would be great. So if you have the Bible app, I encourage you to pull up this part of it. If you plot those 5 things against modern American politics, 2 of them sound liberal. The first 2, which was diversity, equity, and inclusion, and across socioeconomic lines, caring for the poor. Those sound liberal. There are 2 things that sound conservative, which was active resistance to infanticide and abortion, and resolute in its vision of marriage and sexuality between one man and one woman for life. And the third one kind of sounds like neither. Like there really isn't either side of the political spectrum that's actually nonviolent, both on a personal level and a political level. So chances are for each of us, when you read through those 5, or hear them in this case, there are a couple of those that we agree with more than the others. But to be totally honest, these are very clearly supported by the teachings of Jesus. So if you find yourself aligning with some, but not all of these, especially along those liberal and conservative lines, it's an indication that you may be placing an allegiance to a political party or ideology above allegiance to Jesus. And this is understandable because it's very common in our culture. But that's what this whole week is about. We need to be different from the world and from the culture around us. We need to be distinct. We need to be followers of Jesus first. We need to choose to be holy. So another quote from the book. As far back as the 1970s, Leslie Newbigin predicted or maybe prophesied that as the West secularized, religion would not go away. It would redirect to politics. He warned of the rise of the political religions. We're living in his vision. Our nation is more divided than it has been since the Civil War. Right and left are no longer 2 opposing sides that keep each other in balance. They are 2 rival religions locked in holy war with zealots fighting it out online. So we need to be a people who are defined by our allegiance to Jesus above political party or any other identity-giving association to race, occupation, sexual orientation, gender identity, nationality, socioeconomic status, or even Hogwarts house. As Christians, our first allegiance must be to Jesus. Otherwise, we are Democrats or Republicans who respect Jesus and agree with some of what he says, but do not follow him. Now, those 5 features are one way to identify the world in our modern times. There is another way that is helpful and is based on a verse from Isaiah. That verse reads, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil." And this harkens back to the step of sin being redefined as anything but sin. Again, often something that sounds at least harmless, if not something that's actually good in itself. Comer shares a good list of examples. I was going to cherry pick and take some of these out, but I think I was going to leave out the ones that I'm the closest to agreeing with being okay, which isn't great. So I'm going to include all of them. Again, it would help to have the Bible app on this. So, all right, here are the examples. One is lust being redefined as love. Second, marriage not as a covenant of lifelong fidelity, but of personal fulfillment. Third, divorce as an act of courage and authenticity rather than a breaking of vows. Fourth, the objectification of women's sexuality through porn as female empowerment. Fifth, greed as responsibility to shareholders. Gross injustice toward factory workers in the developing world as globalism. Environmental degradation as progress. The deracination or uprooting of once thriving local economies as free market capitalism. Racism as a past issue. Marxism as justice, and abortion as reproductive justice. In case you're curious, the ones I was close to deleting, or not including, are all of the economic and business-related ones. It's possible that my education in business and economics flavor my beliefs, and that could be an area that I need to look at being impacted by my version of the world. However, the example that we're going to dive into to understand this one better is the last one, abortion, aka infanticide or killing infants as reproductive justice. I know this is a controversial topic and that you may find yourself being offended, and that is fair. This kind of points to what we're talking about. None of us are immune to the pressure to conform to the world, but instead of shutting down, I want to encourage everyone kind of not to fall into the dichotomy of villainizing anyone who disagrees with you. Especially if it's me, but instead to stay at the table and in the conversation, and just be open to what this says. So, all right, abortion or reproductive justice. Like we said, the first step is redefining sin as something else. So the first place that happens again is calling abortion reproductive justice. That's a redefinition. The other one is calling unborn baby is defined as a fetus instead of a person, which dehumanizes them. In that case, abortion is not ending the life of a person or even a future person, but of a fetus. Next, to see the effect, and again, Comer goes through this in a lot of good detail in the book. He pointed to something that really struck me, especially if you're my age or older. He talks about watching the movie Peanut Butter Falcon, which is about a teenager with Down syndrome. He pointed out that you really don't see all that many adults with Down syndrome anymore, at least not as many as you used to. And this traces back to the 1980s when I was born, when the screening came out that could detect Down syndrome in an unborn baby. And basically the reason why we don't see as many adults with Down syndrome is that since then, many of them are quietly aborted after they get the result that the child has Down syndrome. And while the stats on this aren't perfect, for kind of understandable reasons, it's estimated that the US aborts 67% of babies that test positive for Down syndrome, France 77%, and the Scandinavian countries 98%. Iceland is close to 100%. One Icelandic doctor said, "We have basically eradicated Down syndrome from our society." But what he means is that we have aborted all the babies with Down syndrome. He called this genetic counseling. And kind of going further and to the United States, there are leading thinkers, Peter Singer from Princeton, that make the case for killing babies with disabilities, and others calling for after-birth abortions, saying the parents should wait a few days after birth to decide whether they should end the baby's life or not. Kind of trying them on, trying out being a parent, and then deciding whether they want to go forward. So abortion, this latest version of infanticide, is generally looked at as not only socially acceptable, and I say generally, obviously it's a divided issue, so I'm kind of picking one side of it. It's not only socially acceptable, but celebrated as a human right is how it's been redefined. If you disagree with abortion or challenge its logic or morality, you're labeled as regressive or oppressive. Another quote from Comer in the book says, "If you assert that all babies are worthy of love and celebration regardless of disability, you are labeled as anti-progress. Because in the new moral hierarchy, choice, desire, and sexuality free from responsibility are all more important than the life of the unborn. A baby is not seen as a human soul, but as an unwanted responsibility to be terminated." Remember that sin becomes normalized in society by the devil's stratagem. Deceptive ideas. This is redefining sin as something else. In this case, reproductive rights, a human being as a fetus, being pro-choice or for women is kind of the way the stance is taken. These are all positive monikers that deceive the true nature of the sin. It plays to disordered desires. So we have this desire, the disordered desire for not having responsibility, or disordered desires for sex without strings or boundaries, or disordered desires for comfort and ease above the challenge and growth that comes with raising a child. And then they are normalized in a sinful society. Abortion is normalized, protected, celebrated, and advocated for in our society. And disagreeing with it is seen as being backwards, regressive, or morally bankrupt. Somehow, defending the life of the unborn is seen as being morally bankrupt by a lot of people in our society. This is one of the strongest examples of the world and how this plays out. And you can see how we mapped it out. You can clearly show the steps in our society. It includes the twin sins of rebellion against God and redefining evil as good. There are the aspects of freedom and justice that boil down to wanting to live outside of the authority of God. It has the aspect of that which was condemned being celebrated and those who refuse to celebrate being condemned. And as much as I am pro-life and love Jesus, I've got to admit that the pull to conform or just not speak out is very strong. I wrote so many qualifiers in that previous section that I then deleted just to soften it. It's hard. I mean, living in the world and not submitting is hard. To remind us, though, Jesus actually said it would be hard. This is back to one of the verses I shared earlier. It says, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them. For they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. So kind of taking that one step further, if we find ourselves fitting in with everyone around us or with the world, not disagreeing with the broader culture in key ways that are core to Jesus' teaching, then we are probably too much of the world. Instead, Jesus says the world will hate us, which sounds pretty bleak. But don't worry. Just one last point, and then I'll try to spin that back to a positive. So even though the world is an enemy of the soul, and Jesus says here that the world will hate us, remember that there are three definitions of the world. He does not mean that we are in opposition to the people of the world, but in opposition to the anti-God ideas and values and practices that have become mainstream in our culture. Nothing is more clear in reading the Bible than that Jesus loves people. Remember, for God so loved the world. That version meant the people of the world. God so loved them that he sent his son. They are not who our fight is against. They are who our fight is for. When we get this wrong or backwards, sometimes we will see the world hating us because of how we treat people. If we do not keep clear that we love the people of the world and that the world that's being talked about are the ideas that are dangerous and deceptive and anti-God, then you can get to the point where you are different or antagonistic to people around you. And people can be like, oh, Jesus said the world's going to hate me. They hate me. If you're going to be hated by people, let it not be for how you treat them. We are to love the people around us. Love them so much that we don't want them to be deceived by these ideas that are dangerous and destructive. Remember the example of the small sect of Jesus followers who won over the pagan Roman Empire in a few centuries. They did it because of the ways they were different than the culture around them. And we can do the same. Instead of being a piece of either political party, we can be a different way that is subjugated to neither. We can be members of the kingdom of God where Jesus reigns, where he is our candidate. We can be a people who pray that his kingdom will come and that his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And this whole idea of living separate and living different is what we're going to talk about for the next 2 weeks of this series. How we can live in the world as citizens of God's kingdom, how we can be different, how we can be set apart, and how we can be holy. But that's all. Let's pray. Dear God, I thank you for your truth. I thank you that you love us. I thank you that you love everyone in the world, God. I pray that you would help us understand how to live in a way that is true to you, true to your truth, to live in the world, to love people, but not be influenced and not be pulled in ways that are against you, that the world pulls us, God. Lord, I thank you that we are able to gather. I thank you that we are able to come together and that you are with us. We can worship you, Lord. God, we love you. We pray these things in your holy name. Amen.
Thank you for joining the Damascus Road podcast. Our mission is to follow Jesus together by being with God, loving everyone, transforming people, developing leaders, growing new ministries, and changing the world. You can find out more about us online at DamascusRoadTucson.com.